The Orris Project. Book 1, Origin and Earth, by David J. Salisbury. Episode 8. 13. The envoy woke 6 hours later, feeling almost as exhausted as he had when he fell asleep. No oxygen up here, he thought. This is terrible. He laid still for another 5 minutes, breathing deeply, trying to pull as much of the scarce free oxygen into his blood as possible. He sat up and looked around. To his right, a steep slope that looked as though it might stretch down a mile to the flat plains below. To his left was a flat, dusty beige surface, and nothing higher. He was on a plateau. It measured 20 yards across where he sat, but widened considerably further north, and once he stood and regained his complete sense of direction, he saw that it stretched northeast, not due north. There were few features on top of the near-level surface of rock, rubble, dust, and sand, but in a handful of places, there were larger rock outcroppings. He walked and smiled when he saw a round opening in the ground after only 10 minutes. Upon closer inspection, he could see that it was a sheer drop into darkness, probably a drainage point, but the good news was that there was a cave system in the mountain. The envoy needed to find an entrance he could use and then find a relatively safe place to stash himself while he made the long run, the one that would hopefully end with a planet rich in free oxygen and with an established and growing body of not just animal life, but intelligent life. It's a lot to ask for when you're throwing a dart in the dark, he thought. There were dark rain clouds approaching from the southwest, and he thought they would reach him before the day was out. That might not be a terrible thing, he thought. Running water made sleep difficult but offered a lot of valuable information if you were looking for cave entrances beneath your feet. The rain would not come for hours, though, and he had every intention of finding the entrance without its assistance. He continued to explore the plateau for the next 3 hours and found 2 more vents, as he thought of them. Circular openings in the ground that offered only a fatal entrance into the cave system below. The vastness of the plateau encouraged him. He still could not make out a defined endpoint, but it was narrowing after having achieved a maximum width of 200 yards. The light had dimmed considerably, and large droplets of rain pelted the back of his head and neck. He drew the blanket from his bag and draped it over himself to at least rid himself of the discomfort of the impact. It rained hard for several minutes, and pools formed on the plateau. The water moved in every direction. Relief washed over him, being in a prime place for lightning strikes, when no thunder accompanied the rain. Head down he walked, watching the water swirl and slide and tumble across the surface. He spotted a small stream of water establishing itself, with hundreds of tiny tributaries running northwest, toward the closest edge of the plateau. He imagined it would get bigger and gain a bit of speed before launching itself off the cliff. Following it with his eyes, he saw he was right. Moving on, he found 3 more of the small streams running off the edges, and then he saw one that flowed rapidly toward the interior of the large plateau. It had all the tributaries of the past 4 streams, but was not making a bolt for any of the edges. It ran toward a large outcropping, maybe 11 feet tall and about twice as wide, with sharp, jagged edges, and much taller on the right than the left. He was still 20 yards away, but it looked more and more like the stream smacked right into the rock and disappeared. As he approached it, he slowed and watched his footfalls carefully, not wanting to go where the water was going, at least not yet. When he was upon it, he smiled, filled with tentative joy. It was another vent, and it was larger than the others, but he had no way of surveying the entrance point, as it was then accepting large volumes of water. The envoy stood there staring at the crashing end point of the stream and thought about his current situation. There would be an hour before the sun went down. The sky to the far east was bright, but to the west it was a dark leaden color. No end in sight for the rain. His water bottles were mostly full, but he took out the empties and filled them anyway, for something to do. The one thing he would not do was leave the position. The plateau was not enormous, but it was big enough that he did not want to risk losing his place. With his bottles full, he optimistically began preparing for the long run. He drank 3 bottles of water in a row, an excellent prescription for an upset stomach. The stretching routine normally took 40 minutes, but he took his time and spent an hour working through it. While he did not think there would be much sleep in his immediate future, the outcropping had a flat place about 2 feet square on the lower edge, only a foot off the ground. The next course rose into the air at a smooth angle. He sat on the small flat platform and leaned back on the roughly 45-degree upslope. He placed his pack on his lap and draped the blanket over his head and down to his toes. Sleep drifted in and out for 2 hours. When the rain stopped, he pulled the blanket off his face, shifted his position, and slept for the rest of the night. 14. The envoy awoke as day was breaking, and the still steel-colored clouds in the sky were thinning in places. Standing up and walking around to the foot of the outcropping, he wanted to look down into the chasm, but the light was not strong enough. He could only see darkness and the ghosts of shapes. Another 15 minutes would pass before the edges of the opening revealed themselves. As they did, he skirted the edge, pressing down with one tentative foot to find any weak spots, but no material broke off. Except for the long, flat edge created by the outcropping itself, the hole was an oval about twice as wide as he was tall. The area around the entrance was getting brighter, but the depths remained the color of tar. He sat on the edge with his legs dangling in the opening and thought to look at the Sterilex placard while he had the light to do so. Although it was still not bright, he could read the metal card, and he did not bother looking through the numbers. The last prescription, the longest stint, read 3B R2G10. The problem with the formula was that he had used it on Telraid in a similar situation and had undershot by over 300 million years. The short stints to make up for that were torture, and he had no intention of going through that again. Knowing that each grade on the larger rod worked out to about 300 million years, he had every intention of making his own G11 prescription. He vaguely remembered Arthur Sterrett telling them that the Sterilex would not or would never be the problem regarding their survival, and there was never a warning about taking too much. He replaced the placard back in the satchel and stared down into the hole. It appeared the outcropping continued down into the depths, and he could see many other features. It was not smooth rock, but appeared to be a mostly vertical shaft that dropped straight through to the center of the landmass. As the sun trekked through the sky and the hole got brighter and brighter, it became clear that climbing down would not be easy, but it would be possible. There were hundreds of hand and footholds. He elected to put the satchel in his bag, hoping the bag would do a better job protecting it, cinched the throat tightly, and knotted it for good measure. With his bag on his back, he stepped down into the hole. 15. After descending 30 feet, the envoy found a solid ledge to stand on with both feet. He stood there, leaning against his bag and pinching it between him and the rock face. Pointed toward what he expected was the cavern or whatever the cavity in the plateau was, he shut his eyes tightly and covered them with his hands for good measure. In his mind, he counted to 100 to establish the best low-light vision he could. When he opened his eyes, he saw the wall of rock 4 feet in front of him much more clearly. Down further still, he thought, and continued climbing down. After 50 more feet, he reached the floor. Brief glances upward blinded him again in the low-light environment, but he could go no further down. He repeated his light sensitivity ritual, and was heartbroken to find he was staring at the same rock wall. It had chased him all the way to the bottom. Although it was not perfectly circular, the vent amounted to a tall, straight shaft down, with no apparent destination. He searched the uneven floor, thinking there must be some outlet, otherwise the space would be full of water. He was right. The shaft totaled 4 feet wide by 7 feet long, and in the bottom corner to his left was an opening close to the floor. He laid down and pushed his head through the passage, which he was unsure would be big enough for his rib cage. He was looking not into a huge cavern, but a trough that got wider as it got higher. It had been much narrower in its infancy, but running water had carved it out over the ages. It extended further back than he could see and was over 100 feet tall where he could make out the ceiling. There were 4 shafts of light, the vents delivering a weak glow to the interior. The sloped walls were far from smooth, covered in irregularities and pockets, ledges and small outcroppings. He backed up, took off his bag, and pushed it through the opening. After spending a minute to work up the courage, he laid down on his back, reached both hands through the hole, and grabbed the inside wall of the trough. He rocked his head to the side, but his skull, ear, and face still scraped the top side of the opening as he pushed with his dug-in heels. The whole of the opening hugged his chest and armpits, and he breathed slowly and deeply while he could. No matter what happens, don't panic. He let the majority of the air escape his lungs and pushed with his feet and pulled his arms. The pressure on his ribcage increased after sliding only a few inches, and the pain started. He kicked and pulled harder, and a pang of panic flashed through his mind when he attempted to inhale, and the pain doubled. Relax, exhale, and push. Exhale all the way this time. The calmer, reasoned voice in his head prevailed over the impending panic, and he pushed more of the air from his lungs, pushed with his feet and pulled with his arms. He felt the opening slide to the base of his ribcage and stop. The earth was crushing him. He could not inhale for fear of cracking a rib, and he was stuck. The envoy closed his eyes hard and clenched his teeth. Dig deep. There has to be air left in your lungs. Push it out. The pain was agonizing, but he forced the last bit of breath he could muster out of himself. Kicked, pulled, and writhed back and forth until finally, the ribs on his right side freed themselves from the grip of the opening, followed immediately by the left. He laid half in and half out of the trough for 10 minutes, enjoying each breath. His concern for his hips making it through proved fruitless. He had lost so much weight that they slid through easily when he was moving again. The first conclusion he came to upon taking his first few steps in the trough was that it had to go deeper, or there had to be an outlet to the outside. He was once again walking on damp, uneven rock. The water had not pooled here at all. The second conclusion was that the roof had an expiration date and would collapse long before he woke up. It was a fact that brought a great deal of disappointment to the envoy, and he began thinking the exploration had been all for nothing. He would have to climb back out, descend the northern edge of the plateau, and continue north. If I can climb out, he thought, if I want to torture myself again. There were ledges and shelves cut throughout the walls to his left and right, and he explored while the light was available and planned to sleep down there for the night. Halfway up a ledge that looked like it extended over 50 yards into the trough at a 10-degree angle, he was at a point where he could lift himself onto the next step. It was like climbing a huge flight of stairs. He did the same thing 2 more times and found that he had reached the halfway point of the total climb. The shafts of light illuminating the trough were bending and narrowing, and he noticed it was already getting darker. He also noticed a new shaft, not even a shaft really, but a pin of light coming in at a much sharper angle, brighter than the others. It was possibly due to the fact that he was still staring at the intense beam of light, or the fact that the general lighting in the trough was failing, but he never saw the gap. He started walking, and his third footfall landed on clear, open air. A moment into the fall, he grasped at the shadows in front of him, connecting with the other side of the gap only enough so his face crashed into his arm and not the rock itself. He could not establish a grip and fell straight down into the black. This is it, was the thought going through his mind when he landed in the muck. First his feet, then his buttocks, then his back. To his amazement, other than his forehead and nose and the arm they smacked into, he did not feel any intense pain. He had even managed not to hit his head on the sludgy ground he was lying in. How many times can one man get this lucky? He pressed his hand into his landing pad and rubbed the contents between his fingers. Not sand, finer. Silt, he thought. It was wet, but there was no standing water. The mountain had excellent drainage. He sat up in the darkness and looked above. He could still see the pin and watched it fade and blink out. The darkness was complete. It would be 8 hours at least, but probably 10 before he could hope for any light. And he suspected when that time came, it would not be much. He abandoned his vision for the time being and mapped the area by touch. He slowly and carefully navigated around on his hands and knees, touching the floor and the walls. The room was disturbingly small. He knew there were no drop-off points, ledges, or any other dangers of the sort, and also that the muck was only on one half of the floor. He stood up slowly, and retraced his crawling assessment of the entire space. It was round and 6 paces in diameter. He went around again, paying close attention to the condition of the surrounding walls. They were all sheer. The only material in the place was the silt. No small or large rocks to build a set of stairs. No cracks in the walls, no ledges or steps, nothing to grip with either hand or foot. He was trapped. I'm going to die here. As he tried to think of escape strategies, the thought kept repeating itself. He closed his eyes. Not that it made any difference visually, but for the comfort of it. He told himself to think, there has to be a way out of this. And there was. There were 2, actually. The pill or the still, his fellow envoy, Tom Hawley, had always been fond of saying in the meetings they had with Dr. Ben Estes, the survival theorist. Tom alone thought it was clever and said it often. When in a dire situation, the pill would kill you, and the still was a reference to the fact that one did not move while under the influence of Sterilex. The pill or the still, Tom? I think I've finally reached that point. The envoy spoke only to thin air. One way or the other, he did not have to decide right then, so he laid down to sleep, waiting to get a good look in the morning when there was light. 16. When the light finally came, it was miserably dim. Even though he understood that the source was dim to begin with, it did not ease his frustration. His pupils were at maximum dilation, yet he could make out little but dark shadows among slightly darker shadows. There was one sharply black vertical line on what he suspected was the west wall, had he not entirely lost his bearings. That's where the water goes, he thought, and since I'm not 1/4 of an inch thick, I can't perform the same trick. Why would anyone take the pill? It surprised him to find he was speaking out loud. If the option is pill or still, why wouldn't you just risk the still? He thought about it for a few minutes. Cowards. It's the only answer, at least in a situation like this. He took his bag off his back and walked to the rockier side of the small room. There was no way he would go under while lying under the same gap he had dropped through. The light was getting to its brightest point, but it was still inadequate. The only saving grace was that the administering rod was glass and very reflective. As long as he didn't wait, he could put himself under with an accurate dose. A big dose, he thought. There was only one positive to going under for a long time. The large dose of Sterilex took you out quickly. The dreams were fast and then you were gone. There was no panic. Waking up was hell. The envoy rolled out his blanket and opened the salve in his satchel, the contents of which had survived the fall. He also tossed a full bottle of water onto the blanket. I know I'll need it as soon as I wake up. Why not make it easy? He walked over to the far side of the hole and urinated into the silt. Once he was back, he applied the salve to his body and prepared the administration devices. Headbag on, he dipped the rod into the Sterilex up to the 5 hash and applied it to his tongue. He quickly did it again, this time to the 6 hash mark. G11 achieved. It was time to start the long run. 17. He was in his cocoon awaiting the inevitable nightmare. His breathing was slowing noticeably. Before he slept, he could hear a soft sound that at first sounded like radio static but got louder and louder, and he recognized it as solid rocket fire. He could see stars and, something's wrong. No, there isn't. You're fine. He was orbiting Sochi, the people of Osa's nickname for their sun. Sochi was growing, and he could see Osa in the distance, a blue dot. Sochi grew and swelled and burned Osa to ash, and then further burned the ash into nothing at all. Sochi came, and Sochi took it all. Sochi took every fiber of what once was Osa, his home, and then Sochi died. All that remained was a tiny white dwarf, an eternity away from the envoy's hole.